Good evening. Welcome to today's special panel. It's entitled Free Expression and Canadian Perceptions of Islamophobia, Anti-Palestinian Racism, Anti-Semitism, and the War in Israel-Palestine. I'm Jim Turk, the director of the Center for Free Expression. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you tonight is the traditional territory of many nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. Tonight's panel is a special joint initiative by the Center for Free Expression, the Provocation Ideas Festival, Conversation Canada, the Green Line, and Innovative Research. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to describe our format for this evening. After introductions, the panelists will discuss Canadians' views of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, and anti-Semitism, as well as the limits to free expression and the impact of international conflicts on Canadians. They will draw on new national polling to explore these critical issues, highlighting how ancestral homeland conflicts affect Canadians. After about 30 to 40 minutes of their conversation, the moderator will bring the audience into the conversation, and you'll have chances to ask questions and receive answers. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. We don't use the chat during this webinar version of Zoom, but we do use the Q&A button. So as you're listening to the conversation, if any question comes to mind, if there's something you'd like to ask one of the panelists or the whole panel, just click on that Q&A button and write down your question while you think of it. You don't have to wait until we get to the session where the audience is brought into the conversation. At the time that happens, the moderator will ask Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, to read out the first question, which she will do. The panelists will discuss it, and then we'll go to the second question and so forth. So please feel free to ask questions as you like answered. This is a topic in which there should be lots of questions, and I hope you feel free to take advantage of the wonderful panel we have. I'd like to introduce Mark Rosenfeld to, in turn, introduce our panel. Mark is the founder and director of Provocation Ideas Festival, and really the brains behind this whole event. Mark?
Thanks, Jim, and a warm welcome to this evening's collaborative event. I'll keep my introductory comments brief so that most of the time can be devoted to the conversation itself. As Jim was alluding to, the war in Gaza and more broadly Israel and Palestine has figured prominently in the media and has affected several communities in Canada with ties to the region, as it has across the globe. And there are many questions that can be asked. So how have Canadians viewed the Israel-Palestine geopolitics? What has been the impact on domestic social movements? And in viewing the response in Canada to the region's geopolitics and the war, what do Canadians view as acceptable expression and protest, and what's deemed unacceptable? What are we to make of growing incidents of racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, and their relationship to the conflict? The Provocation Ideas Festival has worked with Innovative Research on a national survey addressing some of these questions, which was released yesterday, and the poll results can be found on the Provocation website, provocation.ca, under the 2024 poll tab. The poll results, which will be discussed in this conversation, really provide a reference point and a point of departure to explore the issues and questions that I've just mentioned and Jim referred to, and of course others. And this evening's speaker are really well positioned to bring their insights, their knowledge, and their expertise to the conversation. Again, my introduction to the speakers is going to be very brief. More information about each speaker can be found on the Provocation website, provocation.ca, for this event. So I'll begin. Greg Lyle is the president of the Innovative Research Group, which conducted the national survey I was referring to. Welcome, Greg. Jasmine Zine is a professor of sociology, religion, culture, and Muslim studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. Welcome, Jasmine. Diala Hamza is an associate professor of Arab history at the Université de Montréal. Welcome, Diala. Philip Slayton is a lawyer, a writer, and author of the recent Anti-Semitism and Ancient Hatred in the Age of Identity Politics. Welcome, Philip.
Thank you.
I'd also like to mention that Dalia Farah, who was scheduled to speak, had to cancel her participation due to a family emergency. Our moderator this evening is Nehal El-Hadi, who is the science and technology editor at The Conversation Canada. So, over to you, Nehal.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Okay, sorry, everything froze for a second. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me tonight. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you. And I'm really, really interested to hear what your expertise and research brings to it. But to start off, Greg, would you like to talk to us and lead us through an overview of the poll and its results?
Sure. And as Mark mentioned, the poll is available in all of its details on both the Provocation website and our own. I'm just going to hit a couple of highlights. So one thing I think is important just for everyone to be aware of is what we were focused on in this study. It was a study conducted in an online survey in May of 1,872 Canadians. Because we oversample various regions within that survey, it's actually weighted down to 1,000. And we looked at two questions: whether Canadians can agree on the bounds of public debate and protest on this issue, and whether Canadians with strong views on one side or the other are consistent in the bounds that should apply to each side of the debate. When we asked people overall if they tended to agree with Israel's view or agree with the Palestinian point of view, Canadians are pretty evenly split on that. 27% actually feel split and agree with some on both sides. 22% take Israel's view, 18% take the Palestinian point of view, and a third don't have a point of view. And it's important to note about half of Canadians say they're paying at least some attention to the issue, but the other half are attending to other issues or just the challenges of daily life. When we ask people about whether it's important or not for Israel to exist as a Jewish state and whether it's important to create a state for Palestinians, the numbers are very similar. We have 52% supporting Israel's existence as a Jewish state, and 49% saying it's important to create a state for Palestinians. And what's interesting is compared to other issues where normally we see what behavioral scientists call motivated reasoning, normally we would expect in a hotly contested issue for one side to generally discount the other side, but we don't see that here. Obviously, people that are more likely to take Israel's point of view are more likely to think that it's important for Israel to exist, and the same thing, people that generally take the Palestinian point of view are more likely to say that it's important to create a state for Palestinians. But there are more of the pro-Palestinian people that believe that there should be a state for Israel than disagree with that. And there are more that take Israel's point of view more often that believe there should be a Palestinian state than disagree with that point of view. And that's unusual. And for those that are proponents of civic engagement and civil discourse, that's an encouraging sign compared to other issues. When we ask people how they feel about speech that supports Israel's right to exist, or the right of Palestinians to have their own state, or speech that opposes Israel's right to exist or opposes Palestinians having their own state, we see again very similar responses. Canadians are just as likely to support people supporting Israel's right to exist as supporting the right of Palestinians to have their own state. And similarly, they're just as likely to support opposition to each of those propositions. And again, when we looked at the more detailed results, we found that each side was a lot more accepting of the other side's point of view than we often see in these sort of discussions. When it comes to speech that calls for violence against Jews or Muslims, or speech that calls Jews or Muslims a threat, we see almost identical levels of unwillingness to accept that discussion. So once you move from debate about political ideas and you move to discussion that even hints at violence, you can see Canadians draw a pretty firm line. And that's not discounting the fact that there are clearly more actual events of violence, discrimination, hate speech in the general environment. What it does tell us, though, is that overall, Canadians don't condone that behavior, that it is out of step with where mainstream Canadians stand, which is better than the opposite. And we know that there are other places in the world in which threats of violence or calling people a threat is far more acceptable than it is in Canada today. When we ask people about activities, what sort of protest, what sort of political action are people willing to accept? Again, what we see, the pattern is very similar for whether an activity is conducted by people who are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. It's either equally likely to be acceptable or equally likely to be unacceptable. Marches are something that more people are willing to support than oppose. Any other level of activity raises some concerns. So again, for those of us that are interested in promoting the idea of political debate and acceptance of dissent, the fact that there's opposition to camps, whether they are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, might be a concern in general. If someone has a camp in the middle of a common and it's not interfering with students' abilities to go to school, why would people be opposed to that? So we might be generally concerned about how much opposition we see. But the good news is that the general attitudes towards both sides of this debate are very similar. And that's, in a nutshell, what we've got. But again, I would encourage you to take a look at more details on either our website or the Provocation Festival's website.
Thank you very much, Greg.
And I'm hoping that stops sharing.
You're still sharing.
Now we stopped. There we go.
Thank you so much. I think I'm going to start by asking each of you, Diala, Philip, and Jasmine, in that order, from your perspective, what do you think these findings indicate? So Diala, if I could start with you, please, and then go to Philip, and then close up with Jasmine.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation and the chance to actually react to this important poll. So I think, in general, I think I'm reading what is not explicit. I'm reading what is maybe behind what is obvious in those results. And for that reason, I think the poll is very important, because it might actually show more than it is. It seems to show. Anyway, so let me get to the point. So as far as the first set of results is concerned, which is that the poll has found that Canadians generally seem to support a state for Palestinians and a state for Israelis. I mean, so one way of viewing this would be to say this is comforting, and I think the poll shows that those who support Israel seem to be now supporting also a state for Palestinians and vice versa. But you could also see it in another way, which is this way of establishing a symmetry, like there should be a state for one people and there should be a state for the other, is actually not recognizing the context in which the whole statehood issue is unfolding, which is the colonial context, which is the colonial asymmetry, the huge asymmetry of power, because we are not faced with two peoples equally equipped, armed, and resourced. We are faced with a colonial power crushing a colonized people. So in that respect, I read the balanced view in favor of two states as somehow concerning, and not just or not as a sign that Canadians are peace-loving and tolerant people, but maybe or also as a people. Without, of course, pinpointing or generalizing, but that there seems to be some unawareness or some denial of the profound asymmetry of power between Israelis and Palestinians, between colonizers and colonized, between oppressors and oppressed. And, just to finish on that point, the two-state solution is also the official Canadian position. So there is no surprise here. I mean, it is still the official position, despite the fact that, the so-called solution has been dead for at least, if not more than 20 years. And it has, unfortunately, since it has been declared dead by the Israelis and killed by the Israelis, it has served Israeli and not Palestinian and Israeli interests, in the sense that it has actively since then stifled any critical point of view on a solution that would be something else than the two-state solution. Yeah, I don't. So I'll just stop here because I
have room for a lot more later, but
address the first question. Yeah.
Philip, over to you, please.
Thank you. A couple of sort of initial responses to the poll. The first is, like Greg, I take some comfort in the results of this poll. It reaffirms what I certainly hope to be the case, which is that Canadians on the whole there are exceptions, of course, there are extremes, but on the whole are reasonable, balanced, and fair people. And that's, in this day and age, in this world, not that common. So I take some initial comfort in the results of this poll. I do have a sort of a problem with polls of this kind, discussions of this kind in general. And it's that there's a lot of use of language, which I would say is sloppy or imprecise. And you wonder what's behind that use of language. So for example, just to pick one thing more or less at random, the poll refers to whether or not people support the Israeli point of view. There is no real Israeli point of view. I mean, there is a point of view of the Israeli government, which faces very stiff opposition. It's a democratic society with all kinds of currents of opinion, often that clash within the society itself, within the state itself in a considerable way. There's great opposition within Israel to many of the things that are now happening. So I wonder how you can extract from that the concept of an Israeli point of view that you support or you don't support, you or whatever. And a similar thing applies to the word anti-Semitism. For my sins, I just last year published this book on anti-Semitism. And one of the things I found in thinking about it and talking to people and writing the book is that anti-Semitism, the word, the phrase, has a very imprecise meaning. The word anti-Semitic, likewise, has a very imprecise and elusive meaning. It's meant different things at different times to different people. And so when you talk about anti-Semitism, or how you feel about it within the society or as expressed by individuals, it's a very tricky concept. There have been attempts to define it, including most recently, I guess, and most famously, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which I regard, and many people regard, as hopelessly inadequate. So my point is, what are you in fact talking about when you talk about anti-Semitism, when you try to define attitudes towards it? Now, take Islamophobia. I don't know whether the same thing could be said of Islamophobia, but I think it's a reasonable question to ask, what is that? And how does it express itself? I'd also make the point, about getting back to anti-Semitism, that people talk about, well, anti-Semitic incidents. They talk about the rise of anti-Semitism. There are Jewish organizations in Canada and elsewhere that say last month there was a dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents, and they will put a number on it. What are those incidents? Not every incident is like every other incident. Some incidents might be relatively trivial and not of grave consequence, others quite the opposite. So my general point here is there's a lot of imprecise use of language. There's a lot of discussion of concepts and reaction to concepts when it's not clear what exactly we're talking about. So there's a general murkiness and a lack of clarity in discussions of this kind.
So before we go to you, Jasmine, I'd love to ask you, Philip, what do you think needs to be clearly established before we can proceed in having a fruitful and generative discussion or poll or conversation about this topic?
Well, I mean, that's a difficult question to answer, but I'm not sure there is a final dispositive answer to your question. This is the answer. But I would suggest that we need to have a considerable sensitivity to the elusive and often murky nature of these concepts and definitions of these words and phrases. And we have to recognize it's not simple. And we have to recognize that they fit within a historical context, a cultural context, a modern geopolitical. These are extraordinarily complex issues. And you can't just distill them down to something simple that can be easily described as this or that or something else. So I think it's not maybe a very satisfactory answer to your question, but I think we need to be very sensitive we need to ask ourselves, what exactly are we talking about?
Right.
And try and answer that, which was not easy.
I agree with you there. There's also some of the things that you, like Diala had pointed out, what's not being said here, like with these equivalencies or asymmetries that are being presented in a particular way. You are also talking about the slippery nature of what it is we're actually saying. And I think that that's a really good place to start the conversation after we hear from Jasmine. So I'd like to come back to those points. But Jasmine.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to also thank all the partners involved in mounting this timely poll. I think it's an important intervention and something that tells us some things, but also some things that, as Jella has pointed out, what's not said or in the context of, and lack of context, sometimes there's other kinds of conclusions that we may draw from the results. And so I think I had a similar take on the poll that Diala did in terms of, we may be too quick to celebrate the multicultural civility in some of the survey findings, and what seems like a balanced approach to what is actually genocide is troubling. It is not a balanced conflict with two equal sides, as Diala has pointed out and given us the historical context for that. And so for this to be seen sort of as the equal support for both sides narrative erases that asymmetrical relations of power that exist and erases the horrific nature of this genocide. Similarly, the survey found that campus protests supporting either a pro-Palestinian or a pro-Israeli stance received little support, especially if they were considered, quote, disruptive. And, that seemed to be consistent with how Canadians view previous kinds of protests around other social movements, as was referenced by earlier polls. And this speaks to a kind of business as usual attitude where public anti-genocide protests and student encampments at universities have become inconvenient when they're addressing the issues that they are there to raise awareness about in ways that are seen as disruptive to the comfort of a wider society who has the luxury of looking the other way. And so we're already seeing how students who are demanding ceasefire and that their universities divest and disclose and divest rather from any military or corporate interests supporting genocide, they're being doxxed, harassed, threatened, intimidated, and sued. And in addition to these neo-McCarthyist kinds of tactics, they're being subjected to police in riot gear, armed with batons and rubber bullets, and yet they are the ones being viewed as a threat or a disruption to public order. And I think this is something we need to consider because universities are meant to be spaces for critical thought and social and political engagement, preparing students to be agents of change and transformation in the world. And that includes exercising their right to free speech and public protest. And yet when students act according to these rights and values, their own institutions where they learn these moral responsibilities viciously turn against them. And furthermore, according to this poll, they lack wider public support for their courageous stand. Now, bringing in the framework of anti-Palestinian racism that was put forward by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association helps us understand this within that purview. Because APR, anti-Palestinian racism, refers in part to, quote, exerting pressure to exclude or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, end quote. And that is one of the features that characterizes this form of racism and discrimination, and that's evident in the backlash that students are experiencing at these campus protests and encampments. So I just wanted to contextualize that result a little bit further. And there are other results that I wanted to comment on, but maybe I'll stop there and try and pick it up later.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Those are three very fascinating and important perspectives or approaches to the poll. Philip, I actually want to start with you, and I'm going to pose to you the question that I think Diala answered for herself a little bit earlier on, which is, what do you see as being absent or missing from this poll?
I don't really have an answer to that other than what I suggested before, which may not be the kind of thing that Paul can deal with, the underlying complexity of some of these terms and ideas, which is probably not susceptible to polling technique, which by the way, I know very little about. So I can't really answer your question, but let me take the opportunity to just say something about freedom of expression in response, I think, sort of in response to what Jasmine had to say. I am a staunch, dyed-in-the-wool freedom of expression guy. I firmly believe in it. I was the president of PEN Canada, which is an organization devoted to the freedom of expression. I think it's enormously important. And by the way, I have no problem myself with the student encampments, provided they are peaceful. As far as I'm concerned, the students occupying the lawn in the University of Toronto or in McGill and elsewhere, they can stay there for as long as they like, as long as there's no violence involved. And I would also make this comment as well. There's something odd about the poll, I thought, or perhaps there's something missing. It is actually a crime in this country to speak inciting to violence. I mean, that is not okay. It's criminal. You can get prosecuted and you can get thrown in jail for that. And that's important to remember. It's not just another thing that people can do. You can't do it in this country unless you want to incur the wrath of the criminal law. But anyway, that's sort of a bit of a diversion. But I can't really answer directly your question about, which I think is, what did the poll kind of miss? What subtleties or nuances did it not seize? And maybe, I'm not even sure that polling, perhaps Greg can go to this issue, can capture those kinds of subtleties and nuances that I think are very important.
Thank you. Diala, you had spoken about the way that the poll communicated, and you responded to the semi-optimistic take that, that Canadians had a particular level of tolerance. And I think, Jasmine, you called it multicultural civility. I'd like to ask you both to talk about that a little bit more, just to give you a bit more space to unpack it. So Diala first, and then Jasmine, please.
Thank you, Nehal. So yes, I very much want to comment on this, and second what Jasmine was saying. So, when she mentioned that it seems that protests are acceptable to Canadians as long as they don't disrupt anything, they allow business as usual to go on. So what I see really behind this is a very, very concerning depoliticization of Canadians, a sort of normalization of the idea that, you know, protests should not be disruptive. But, you know, I mean, powers and colonial powers, which Canada have never relinquished power or dismantled their regimes of oppression or injustices out of their own volition. It's only when they are forced to do so that they actually end up dismantling, relinquishing, and granting what people are demanding. Social and human rights are rarely, if ever, won through the ballot box, but on the street, through popular mobilization, through resistance. What we're attending to today is actually universities turning against their own students. I mean, how is this not more shocking than the fact that students may or may not be disrupting education? If they are or not disrupting education, this is maybe to alert to the fact that a population of 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza have had their whole system of education wiped out, razed to the ground. So I'm a bit like taken aback by the fact that people seem to have a problem with protest, this being disruptive. Not that they have been, by the way, you know, that's what is fascinating. Not that they have been extremely civil on the whole. They have been amazingly disciplined. They've had very clear stances. They sought communication with their administrations. They've been waiting and waiting to negotiate with their administrations. And what they're receiving is injunctions. And now the University of Waterloo is suing its own students for $1.5 million. So yeah, what I am reading into the poll, and that's why I really think the poll is extremely important in that respect, is a very concerning depoliticization, and, you know, a normalization of the idea that you can march through the streets, but please do not disrupt traffic. Please do not disrupt our ability to go to our work and to our business as usual.
Thank you, Diala. Jasmine?
Yes, thank you. So I did have another example of where I felt that we may be too quick to celebrate the multicultural civility, and one of the responses to the poll, and that was the response to the question around condemning speech that calls Muslims or Jews a threat to Canadian society. And that speaks a lot to my own research, so that I kind of picked up on that. And so while it was laudable to see that there was a rejection of hate speech and violence, you know, we would not want to see Canadians endorsing hate speech or violence against any group. And both Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and anti-Palestinian racism must be condemned. However, I found those results problematic for a couple of reasons. For instance, again, it assumes that we are dealing with communities that are comparable. It doesn't take into account the different racial demographics of these communities and the way that hate speech impacts communities in different ways. So while in both cases of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, anti-Palestinian racism, hate speech creates a breeding ground for violence. We've seen where mosques and synagogues have been subject to vandalism and violence, for example, and there have been unacceptable levels of hate crime in both communities. More specifically, however, though, Islamophobia in Canada has reached deadly proportions. And Canada leads the G7 in terms of the targeted killings of Muslims motivated by Islamophobia. And this includes the Quebec City mosque shooting in 2017, where 6 racialized Muslim men were brutally gunned down and killed in the 2021 London terror attack, where 4 members of a Pakistani Canadian Muslim family were intentionally mowed down and killed by a truck. And in both cases, the men responsible for these attacks espoused white nationalist ideals. The perpetrator in the London, Ontario attack has since been charged with what the judge ruled was a textbook case of terrorism. And this landmark ruling is the first time terrorism on the grounds of white nationalism has been recognized in Canada. Now, both assailants in these cases referred to Muslims as posing a threat to Canadian society, as an existential threat to physical safety, a demographic threat, a civilizational threat, and a cultural threat. And those kind of views play into long-standing Islamophobic tropes and conspiracy theories about the Muslim presence in Canada and globally, and they activate racial anxieties and tensions. In fact, I wrote a book looking at how those kinds of tropes and ideas affected Muslim youth in Canada, part of the 9/11 generation, who were consistently seen as threats to the nation. And so these same kind of tropes of Muslims as radicals, jihadists, terrorists, also have become expressed through public policies in Canada. The Anti-Terrorism Act, security certificates, passenger protect program, the no-fly list, where we even have Muslim toddlers named on that no-fly list, are all, underwritten by this idea of the Muslim threat to Canada. We have seen, surveillance of Muslim communities by the security agencies, and we're talking about universities now, what's happening there. The kind of surveillance that they're facing has been built on the architecture of post 9/11 Islamophobia, the expansion of security regimes. And, Muslim student associations have been regularly approached by CSIS, the RCMP counterterrorism units. My son was approached by CSIS after he was elected Muslim Student Association president. So we see the way in which those ideas, when it comes to Muslims, have been translated into public policies, wider practices. And we also see now how those kinds of ideas are being purveyed, that hate speech and propaganda against Muslims. What is unique about that is that there are coordinated, orchestrated, and networked ways that that's being purveyed in Canada. And I did a 4-year study on the Islamophobia industry in Canada, which is a networked ecosystem. And so those ideas are now being surveyed and are having material impacts on Muslims, youth, communities, institutions. For example, the idea of Muslims as a threat to Canada. The CRA is, monitoring Muslim charities. And there was a case where a Muslim charity, well known, actually sued for defamation after being accused as a front for Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood. So what I want to outline is that when we talk about hate speech, we can say, it's important that they are equally condemned, but we have to understand that the consequences are different when we look at different communities. And so being labeled as a threat to Canadian society has had a profound and empirically documented impact on Muslim Canadians. And again, it's an agenda that's being pushed through organized networks, both domestically and globally. And so that's why I see sort of the equal response as not really reflective of the actual conditions and problems that have emerged as a result of the, hateful speech acts and those discourses and ideologies.
Thank you, Jasmine. Philip, you wrote the book Anti-Semitism.
I did, yeah, that's true.
And you wrote the book on the topic. Can I invite you to respond to Jasmine too?
Well, I mean, Jasmine, what she had to say was eloquent and articulate and troubling. I mean, I'm not in a position to credibly assess everything that she said, but I listened carefully to what she said, and it was powerful, no question about it. And to the extent that what she said is accurate, it's troubling for sure. On the question of asymmetry, which I'm not quite certain I know what that means, but I'll take it, run at it anyway. I would point out that the Jewish community worldwide and in various national states, including this country, including Canada, has for a long time, of course, been exposed to the similar kinds of things roughly as Jasmine described the Muslim community being exposed to. So putting aside the whole Middle Eastern war, the asymmetry within the Canadian communities between the Muslim community and the Jewish community may be not all that great. But that's perhaps worth exploring. I also wanted to make one brief comment in response to something Diala said. She talked about, and again, I'm sympathetic to some of the things she said. She talked about how if I understood correctly, how student protests on university campuses, including the encampments, were sort of politicized. And there was not, I mean, perhaps reading words into what you had to say, but there's perhaps not sufficient understanding that these protests are protests, and they are rightly or wrongly aimed at getting specific change, whether we think that's good change or not. But that's the point. And you can't expect this to be done with the extraordinary civility and everybody's a good fellow and, you know, shaking hands all the time. But you mentioned one particular thing which piqued my interest about marches, let's say, down a highway interfering with traffic, and there's some kind of notion in a polite peace, order, and good government society that that's not right. I mean, traffic has to flow, and marches cannot interfere with that. I think it's important to remember that in a country like Canada, a very diverse country, and that's its great strength, there are many, many interests of many different kinds. And when you have many interests, they inevitably clash. People don't agree on what should happen. And wanting traffic to flow, as anybody who lives in Toronto can testify to this, wanting traffic to flow well is important to a lot of people for all kinds of reasons that aren't trivial. And something that interferes with that maybe is acceptable, maybe is legitimate, but there are conflicting interests that have to be resolved. That's one example, and there's many others. And all this leads me back to what I said, I think more or less at the beginning, and it's kind of, I know it's unsatisfactory, it's not kind of ideological, it's not neat, and it's not subject to sloganeering, but these issues are very complicated, particularly in a free democratic society that's very diverse. They're very complicated. They're very difficult to figure out what they're really about and what can be done. And the answer is, when it comes to what can be done, is very hard to know. I mean, I think the Canadian state and the private sector and civil society has tried in various ways to try and do something about some of these issues, but I guess with more or less spectacular failure, although Greg's poll suggests maybe not complete failure.
I think this goes back to what I was asking you earlier on. So what is it that we need to clarify so that we can move on and have discussions? Because if it just keeps on coming back to these are nuanced, difficult, complex challenges, where do we go from there? Right?
Well, you've asked me that already, and
I have. And you keep on repeating
I didn't supply you with an answer, and that's because I don't have an answer to the question. But all I'm saying is, if you want to seek answers to the question, you first have to clearly understand what the question is.
Yeah.
And you have to recognize its complexity, and it may not be susceptible to any neat answer. I'm afraid I can't do better than that. I'm sorry, but I don't think I can.
No apology needed, but I think that is one of the limitations of polls, is that you don't get to say, this is exactly what we mean by anti-Semitism.
Yes, I agree with that.
By Islamophobia. Here is how the issue is weighted. Here's the context. It's literally, what do you think about this on a scale of 0 to 5? Yeah. Where do you rate?
I agree. And with all due respect to Greg and his fellow pollsters across the nation or across the world, that is a huge limitation of polls. I mean, to say, well, to take the example I gave earlier on about, do you support the Israeli point of view? Excuse me, what is the Israeli point of view? Go to Israel, talk to people there, and you'll find there are many different points of view. And there's conflict within the state about points of view.
Or even to preface it is with, what do you understand the Israeli point of view to be? And then do you agree? Do you not? Right? But you literally wrote the book on anti-Semitism. So where do we need to be before we can have a conversation about anti-Semitism?
Well, I think one of the things we need to be, and this would not apply to this panel, of course, but it would apply to a lot of people who opine on these issues freely, vociferously, often emotionally, dramatically. It would be to have a much better knowledge of and understanding of these issues, the history of the issues. For example, one thing that many people have commented on is that if you go back to, Judaism and Islam and Christianity are all Abrahamic religions. They have a lot in common, and particularly Islam and Judaism have a lot in common. And there have been periods in history when Jews, for example, have lived very happily and productively in Muslim states, notably in the Ottoman Empire. If you go to Morocco, where I was not terribly long ago, not now, but at one point, there was a very vibrant Jewish community living in relative harmony with its Muslim neighbors and respecting each other's cultural practices. So, for example, it would be a good idea if people realize there's nothing natural or inevitable in Muslims and Jews disliking or even hating or killing each other. There's nothing natural or inevitable about that. History shows us other paths. I think there's very little appreciation of that. I mean, people these days don't seem to be interested in or studying history. That's just one example. So I think we need to kind of amplify, enrich the discourse so people have a much better idea of what it's all about. And by the way, for example, take this slogan from the river to the sea, which has been hugely controversial, right? And is being chanted by people on both sides of the argument. And often there was that famous US newspaper article in which somebody went to a student protest where the chant was being used a lot and said to some of the students, well, what are we talking about here? What river and what sea are you talking about? And it turned out that even at that very elementary level, these quote unquote protesters didn't really know quite which river. They thought it was the Nile, perhaps, and what sea we were talking about. You know, take student protests. I mean, I used to be an academic. I was a dean of a law school at one point. And one of the things you know about young people, and this was true of me as well when I was an undergraduate, they like to seize issues. They like to protest. They like to protest against authority. It's natural. They want to do it. Sometimes they seize issues in order to do that aren't quite the right issues, and they're issues they don't completely understand.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I would actually agree with the fact that young people protest for the sake of protest.
I didn't quite say that. I didn't quite say they protest for the sake of protest. There are reasons they like to protest, but sometimes they don't show great discretion or acumen in choosing the issues to protest about.
I would also respectfully disagree with that, but Dial, I think you respond to something.
Yeah, I don't mean to distort anyone's, words, and certainly not, the last speaker. But I just want to refocus us maybe on the words that were actually chosen by the poll. It's not, Muslims and Jews. It's like Israel, Palestine, but I want to react to this because it has always been in the poll. The framework has been the pro-Israel and the pro-Palestine, and I guess the choice to frame the questions in this way was to avoid, actually leading the questions. But I think the outcome has been forcing people into, classifying themselves as belonging to one camp or the other, and not allowing a reframing of the question, which is not, are you pro-Palestine or pro-Israel? It's, are you against genocide and for social justice, self-determination, etc., etc. So by framing it in the way it was framed, I think again I can see, I am reading also things that I found that might not be apparent in the surprising figures that we got to certain questions. If I may be allowed to be specific. So to the question of supporters of Israel and the Palestinians, it was said in the poll, supporters of Israel and the Palestinians respect speech rights of each other. 50% of respondents said they take Israel's view, believe that speech opposing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state should be allowed. But this to me shows that what is not being understood is the violent workings in Canada of the pro-Israel lobby, which does not allow such expressions. Similarly, the surprising result of 62% of those taking the Palestinians' view report thinking that speech supporting Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state should be allowed. this to me shows that the people who have taken that view seem to be unaware that they are actually supporting a genocidal state, a state that occupies, and a state that has produced an apartheid regime.
So,
And
but I would just make the point that just because you think someone should be allowed to say something doesn't mean that you agree with what they're saying.
no, okay, but you know, I mean, the framing is not. It does not allow us to see whether there is awareness that some things that you might want to be saying or allowing are just not possible because of the workings of the way the lobby works in this country. And
Yeah.
maybe the last point, if I may. So a majority of Canadians say that speech supporting either state should be allowed. Yeah, it should be allowed, but again, it is not allowed. You know, supporting Palestinian rights is not being allowed, is being extremely actively suppressed. And this is what we are, you know, witnessing, and which could not come through that poll, and which it would have been very important and interesting to allow anyway. So I just wanted to
I
insist
think
on
that was
that.
the point that I was trying to make with Philip earlier too, is that it's almost impossible for polls not to flatten or reduce or elide information, because their whole purpose is to solicit, like to kind of gauge or to solicit a response without having the time to be able to explain or provide context or definition or a situation. And I think that's a challenge beyond this poll too, the ahistoricizing of conflicts, not just in Israel and Palestine, but really all over the world. And as these conflicts come home and become expressed in Canada, you know, it's how do we figure out a way to contend with, to interact with, to engage with, as Canadians who might have ties elsewhere too. We do have questions from the audience. And can I ask you for what we have, please?
Yes, the first question is from Nick, and Nick asks, why isn't it enough that students on any issue be allowed to protest within the confines of the law? Students are allowed and should be allowed to protest any issue, but why are these encampments necessary? Why should protesters be allowed to storm a hospital, block bridges, block businesses, etc.? Why should protesters have the right to disrupt people's daily lives?
Philip, I'm going to ask you to respond to that one, just because you also have the legal context for it. And
Well,
then
I think that question sort of, to some extent, reflects the point I was making earlier on, which is we live in a society with many different interests. I mean, some people are interested in protesting whatever, expressing their political point of view about whatever, and other people, to put it, you know, kind of a ordinary way, are interested in going about their normal business without being unduly interfered with. And both of those concerns are legitimate. In a society like Canada, they have to be balanced out. The question is, how do you balance them out? In general, as I said earlier on, as a diehard free speech guy, I'm all in favor of most expressions of free speech, and that would include, you know, marches, that would include university student encampments and things of that kind. But I also recognize that there are other people who are not interested in these things and have legitimate concerns and interests that need to be protected, and that could be impinged upon by the activities I just described. So it's the job of the state, it's the job of the government, it's the job of the legal authorities to sort that out. And I might notice, by the way, I might comment that some rather loose reference, I think, was made to how universities in this country are oppressing their students and trying to suppress their expressions of opinion and so on. I mean, I haven't followed this perhaps as closely as I should, but I do note that most universities, like the University of Toronto, for example, McGill University, they're seeking to deal with this through the courts. We do have a court system. We do have a legal system. We do have laws on the statute books that are interpreted and applied, and that's what these universities are trying to do. And it's hard for me to be very critical of their doing that. And by the way, I think in Quebec, for example, the judges rebuffed the attempt of McGill to close down that encampment. The judges weren't buying it. I think in Toronto, that case is still ongoing. It hasn't been decided yet. So To me, that's a good way in a country like Canada to try and deal with these issues. There are opposing interests, there are laws on the books. Let's go to the courts, let's go to the judges, and have them sorted out according to law. That's what this country is about.
Thank you. And let's have the next question, please.
Yeah, the next question from an attendee. They say, your panelists have described Israel as a colonial power. Where exactly did the colonialists in Israel originate? What is the solution you propose for colonialism? Should everyone move back to their point of origin? If so, where should the Jews go?
Who would like to take that one on? Diana?
Well, clearly I should probably respond to that. I think this is exactly what the pro-Israel or Zionist lobby wants everyone to believe or think, is that dismantling everything that is colonial about Israel means operating an ethnic cleansing towards the Israelis and getting rid of all the Jewish Israelis and sending them from the countries they came from. This is not at all what is what it's about. Many Palestinians and many of those who've stopped believing or who never supported the two-state solution have advocated for decades a one-state solution, whereby the country, the state that is called today Israel, would become one democratic state, which it is absolutely not today. It is an apartheid state. And when I mean apartheid, it is not just because it is segregating communities in the Palestinian communities that it occupies in the West Bank, but because it has inscribed in its own constitution. It has a fundamental law since 2018 that says Israel is a racist state, and it is only a nation state for its Jewish citizens. That's a problem because 20% of its citizenry is not Jewish, is Palestinian, Christian, and Muslims. So the solution is dismantling the supremacist ideology that underpins Israel, which is Zionism, and allowing a state with equal rights for everyone. This is what it's about inside of Israel, and it's getting the boots out of the West Bank, out of Gaza, out of East Jerusalem. And it's up to the Palestinian population in those occupied 3 territories to decide their fate. It's not up to Israel. So this is but again, this belongs to another discussion, and this belongs to the Palestinians to decide. But dismantling occupation and colonialism, this is what it means. And where did this come from? It came from European imperialism, who allowed European Jews to come and colonize Palestine, and who promised the country that was Palestine to a European population. This is where colonialism came about in Palestine.
Thank you, Diala. And could we have the next question, please?
Yeah, the next question, an attendee asks, they say the polls show how divided Canadians are about the war in Gaza. Every attempt to talk about the issue generates criticism and strong opposition from those who don't find their position represented, and support from those who like what is being said. What can be done to get beyond this, to get to a place where we can engage each other in ways that move the world closer to a solution to this seemingly intractable division?
Jasmine, would you like to try that one?
Yeah, I think I'll just, pick up on some of what was already said around when we talk about having these conversations, when we talk about engaging these kinds of issues within the public sphere. For example, there is something that's called the Palestine exception to free speech, right? Where there are consequences attached to speaking about Palestine and for on behalf of supporting the struggle and situation that Palestinians are facing in this genocide. And that's where the limits of free speech start to shut down, because they become policed through a whole set of McCarthyist tactics. As I've mentioned before, the doxing and intimidation, and now class action lawsuits and universities suing their students, which I don't agree is a way that universities should be responding to students. Rather, they could be addressing their concerns. And I don't think that these are students, in fact, that are just grasping for ideas. When I visited University of Toronto encampment, the first thing they do is bring you aside and read you the demands that they're there to address very clearly and in a very thoughtful way. Everything they're doing is very well thought out, and it's a masterclass in organizing, in solidarity, and alliance building. And so I think that needs to be said. But those conversations, inevitably, when we have dialogues like this, there's going to be not just backlash, but frontlash. There's going to be contestations. There's going to be letters sent. There's going to be, and they're usually coming from one side contesting either who's speaking as a speaker, Jewish speaker, if they happen to be non-Zionist. That becomes an issue. We've seen immense shutdown of speech, not just for scholars and academics. Many of us have faced this personally, but also for students now. And so those dialogues cannot happen if there isn't a space for that, and if the concerns of Palestinians are not being allowed to be said. And the very shutting down of student engagement on these issues is, showing us the problem, right? That students themselves, who we have taught to be critical thinkers, to be politically engaged, when they do so, are being, dealt with in the most, kind of despicable ways, and confronted with violence, and then told they're the ones that are threatening the public order. So I don't, again, it comes back to these ideas of, where can we have these conversations, and how can we have them without, looking at the consequences of that speech. So just as I mentioned, the consequences of hate speech against Muslims in general it can be quite different, and has been different in the context of our policies and what we've seen happen in Canada. Similarly, the consequences of speech associated with a pro-Palestinian point of view also have consequences, and are being suppressed, and that should be of concern to all of us.
Thank you so much. It's an incredible privilege to be able to have this conversation with you, Jasmine, Diala, and Philip. I'd like to thank you so much for your time and your expertise this evening. And I'd like to thank our audience for their attention. Jim, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Nehal. I just also want to join Nehal in thanking the panelists for an engaging discussion, and to thank the audience as well for joining us this evening for this, and for your questions. I wish we had time for more. I'm sure there are many more. A video of this conversation will be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow, and that website address is cfe.torontomu.ca. As well as the video being posted, we'll also post a list of resources if you want to read more about these issues. We're asking the members of the panel to suggest additional things. We'll have a link to Philip's book on anti-Semitism, and to Greg's poll results, and other things. So please do come, and if you enjoyed this conversation or found it useful, share the link to it with your colleagues and friends. And again, thank you all for coming, and thanks to the panel. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.